I thank the gentlelady for her leadership and that of her co-author, co-anchor, the Honorable Brenda Lawrence and the Honorable Yvette Clarke, for their tenacity, and they are so correct. This is the year, Black Women Rising, and I can't help but celebrate the quote from the Honorable Shirley Chisholm, who I had the privilege of introducing more than once as a younger woman, and one will never forget that experience and never forget the experience of just being around the Honorable Shirley Chisholm and the Honorable Barbara Jordan. They folks came from similar stock on opposite sides of the nation, but they were strong, stern, committed, and ready to serve. And serve, I'd like to think, without foolishness. So I love the quote of Congresswoman Chisholm that said, if there's no chair for you, I'm paraphrasing, at the table, then bring a folding chair. What a celebration. And let me be very clear, it can go for Black women today in the 21st century. I do want to acknowledge and to thank all women in this Women's History Month for their leadership and service, and particularly take note of our lost late colleague, the Honorable Louise Slaughter, and say that if there was ever a mighty woman of great leadership, tenacity, and strength, it was our dear friend Louise Slaughter, and we honor her now and as well in the months to come. But as we talk about women of color, and in this instance, Black women, let me tell my colleagues that I was before about 400 or 500 of my sorors on Saturday, and I must take mention or make mention of Marsha Penn, our president, and we were talking about the famous number 98. And let me make sure I note all of the sorors and different sororities. And for those of you who are not familiar with the sorority, that is a particular unique and special part of Black women's life. I know there are many other sororities, but we take it very seriously. And you can be many colors. I happen to be pink and green, but there are many colors, and I call them all my sorors. They are my sisters. But we were talking about the power, and I use the number 98. I used that same number when I spoke with Stacey Abrams in Georgia just a few weeks ago, that may in fact be the first African-American woman nominee for governor, and she is running for that position in Georgia. She may be one of the great leaders coming forward, but the 98 number is, as my colleagues know, 98% of African-American women cast their vote that catapulted Senator Doug Jones into the United States Senate. They are change makers and tree shakers. And that's what I want to say about Black Women Rising. They are, in fact, those tree shakers. And might I say and pay tribute to Ivelita Jackson, my mother, Valerie Bennett, Sarah Jackson, Sybil Gooden, Olive Jackson, my grandmother, Vannie Bennett, my grandmother, Mrs. Sims, my great-grandmother, Audrey Reed, my aunt, and Vicki Reed, my aunt, Vicki Bennett, my aunt, along with Valerie Bennett, my aunt. All of these women surrounded me and gave me the kind of tenacity and strength that I can be proud of. And I also want to acknowledge women like Dr. Alexa Kennedy, the first African-American woman neurosurgeon, and Oprah Gail Winfrey, Mississippi native, who has turned into a multi-millionaire, upwards of a billionaire. And the story of Sojourner Truth, who was left off of the suffragette statute. But women gathered, myself and Senator Clinton carried the legislation, but C. Dolores Tucker was the inspiration. And she did not rest until Sojourner Truth found her place in the United States Congress. Rosa Parks, who now sits in Statutory Hall, to the tribute of many members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I certainly thank our chairman, Mr. Richmond, for creating these opportunities for us to have this kind of experience. But let me now get to the crux of what we need to do to be fair to Black women. First of all, we need to quash, extinguish the stereotypes a welfare queen, incarcerated women, women with children and no spouses, and really talk about the mountains that black women have climbed to raise children and to create heroes across the spectrum of leadership, from science to medicine to education, and yes, to sports. Let's make sure that we never have a president that says sons of a bee to malign the many mothers, many of them African American, who are the mothers of sports persons who only because of their upbringing had a sensitivity to criminal justice reform. Let us always characterize the mothers of the movement for what they are, not individuals who are against law enforcement or order, but mothers who have lost their children in an unfair way. And as we work toward how things should change, criminal justice reform and improving on police-community relations, so that the mothers of Eric Garner, the mothers of Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, of course, some of these were not directly police issues, but they were sons that lost their lives as African-American young men. And Sandra Bland, her mother is a dear friend of mine, lost their lives in ways that should not be. And the same mothers of those law enforcement who have lost their lives, and they mourn. What about bringing them together? Many of the mothers of young African Americans are obviously people of color, but we have lost many in the law enforcement in the same way. My point is that the pain of mothers, the pain of African American mothers, should be treated with dignity. The idea of a mother being on assistance to provide for her children, to be in public housing, should be no labels. There should not be a definition of supplemental food stamps as a hand out as much as it is a hand up. And no one should be trying to save money in the United States Congress by providing boxes of food versus a nutritious system or a nutrition system that food stamps allow, which is to allow someone to go and buy what their family needs and to buy what the formula or what their child with allergies need. So let's first of all establish dignity. And then, of course, if young women who happen to be African American happen to be incarcerated, let's make sure that we are looking to end mandatory minimums so that young women who are caught up in a conspiracy, the law that wraps everyone up, and because of some elements of a spouse or a significant other or boyfriend, that they get caught up in the criminal justice system, that we respond to them as mothers and recognize that they should be having an opportunity to not be entrapped with mandatory minimums so that they are never able to return to their children. Or what about women who are pregnant and incarcerated, many of them Latino and African American women? That we should be able to have a situation where those women are not separated from their children. As I heard Mr. Payne mention the 64 cents per dollar that many women have, many African American women are in those kinds of hourly wage jobs, and therefore we must have the increase in the minimum wage, but more importantly, increase in wages for women working in all capacities, and so that the stagnant wages that have not been impacted positively by the $2 trillion tax cut, we must ensure that. We must ensure the ability of all persons to vote without obstruction, and the dastardly voter ID laws that have been put in place specifically to stymie the vote of people of color, Latinos and African Americans. I would hope that the courts would find them unconstitutional. Motherhood must be promoted, as I indicated, for those incarcerated, but those not. The support of health care, which is what the Affordable Care Act was all about. It was to equalize and to give a protective system for our working mothers or our mothers who could not afford insurance in another way. It's unfortunate that we have tried to, the Congress, the Republican Congress, has attempted to unravel a very strong health care system. Women in the United States military, first I salute them all, but I also salute those African American women who have served in the military, who have become generals. I do want to take note of an organization that I have a deep affection for, and that is NASA. And I'm going to make it very clear that I want NASA to be on notice that I am still going to focus on the precipitous removal of an African-American, well-qualified astronaut with no explanation. The only explanation is we did this wrong and we really need to fix it. But the explanation needs to be why this person is not put back on the astronaut list. And what excuse did you have to remove her, other than the fact that she was an African-American woman? If you have another reason, then you, in this month, in this time that we're honoring women, you need to come forward and discern or to explain why an African-American woman with the credentials, an MD, the credentials who had been training for a large number of years, was precipitously removed. And no explanation? These are the kinds of challenges that we face. And so I guess my message is, let us give dignity to these women who are characteristically different. And Sojourner Truth represents a powerful example of that, because she was a tall, dark, regal woman. And the story goes that when she was at the suffragette meeting in New York, or in the Midwest, let me correct, and she either raised her hand or attempted to be recognized, and the person in the front said, yes, sir, what do you want, the gentleman in the back? And she began this long statement that said, ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold into slavery. Although I may be strong-looking and manly-looking, and you may not have recognized that I am a woman that has borne children and had them snatched away from me. And so I think the underlying premise of what we need to do for girls is to stop having the bias of young boys and girls that are African American being expelled or suspended from school in larger percentages than others. We need to make sure that the schools in our community that happen to be Latino and African American, or in these neighborhoods, that they are equal to other schools. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in historically black colleges. We need to invest in technology and coding. And we need to invest in giving our young people opportunity. I want to conclude my remarks by, this is an amazing array of outstanding women. I cannot call all of their names, but I hope that as I call their names, my singular theme of dignity. Dignity doesn't write legislation, but it causes us to write legislation and policies that give women of color, and in this instance African American women, as we honor them in Women's History Month, to give them dignity. And whatever the tools are that gives them dignity, the increase in their minimum wage, the better access to jobs, the better access to housing, and the better respect for the work they do, the lack of dismissing an astronaut with no explanation, and no explanation that they can find. But Tracy Norman is a model, Oprah Winfrey, Shirley Chisholm, Leontine Price, Maya Angelou. We know these civil rights and author. Aretha Franklin, historic, wonderful artist in her own right. Hattie McDaniel, Marian Anderson, Ella Fitzgerald, Althea Gibson, Dorothy Dandridge, chemist Marie Daly, Sarah Good, an inventor. We know the wonderful movie that occurred that talked about NASA women. Della Reese, Miss Muhammad, an athlete, Miss Butler, an author, Mae Jemison, my friend, doctor and astronaut, Tyra Banks, Whoopi Goldberg, Loretta Lynch, Patricia Roberts Harris. Many of us are familiar with her work as a secretary in our United States. Mary Jane Patterson, an educator, and Alice Coachman. So many, and I conclude by simply saying, what we want is dignity, respect, and the ability to serve and to be Americans as we should. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas for really bringing to the fore